They never recognized the beginning of their unraveling because it arrived the same way fog settled over their coastal city, slowly, silently, without warning, until the entire landscape of their life was covered by something they could not name, something soft but suffocating, something that blurred everything familiar into vague outlines. In the early days of their collapse, nothing looked dramatic from the outside. They still woke up to the faint, gray light that seeped through their blinds each morning, still brewed the same bitter coffee in the small kitchen that overlooked the misty bay, still brushed their teeth with mechanical precision, still buttoned their shirt, still caught the same early bus filled with the same tired strangers who clutched paper cups and stared blankly at raindrop-patterned windows. They still walked into the office with a polite nod and a quiet greeting, still sat at their desks surrounded by screens and muted chatter, still attended meetings where people spoke confidently about numbers and strategies and projections, still responded to emails with professional warmth, still produced work that others admired, still carried the reputation of being reliable, composed, unshakable. But inside, something subtle had shifted, something almost imperceptible, like a hairline crack forming beneath the surface of glass. Too small to notice at first, yet destined to widen with the slightest pressure. They began waking with a heaviness in their chest, not painful but persistent, like the weight of a thought they had forgotten to think, a quiet question they were too afraid to ask. They noticed how their breath sometimes caught for no reason, how they would pause halfway through tying their shoes because a wave of blankness washed over them, how sounds seemed slightly muffled, as if they were hearing the world through a layer of water. They brushed these feelings away at first, telling themselves it was just fatigue, stress, the weather, a phase that would pass. But it didn't pass. It deepened. Their mind began drifting at strange moments, during meetings, conversations, bus rides, slipping into a hazy space where thoughts felt distant and slow, as if someone had turned down the brightness of their inner world. They often found themselves staring at their computer screen without reading anything, only realizing minutes later that they had forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. They forgot whether they'd responded to messages, whether they'd eaten breakfast, whether they'd locked the door. Their memory, once sharp and dependable, now felt like a fraying rope slipping through their fingers. Still, they pretended everything was fine. They forced themselves to smile when coworkers asked if they were okay, forced themselves to act engaged during discussions, forced themselves to stay late even when their vision shimmered with exhaustion, forced themselves to push through every small task as if dragging their body through invisible mud. They didn't know how to explain what was happening inside them because nothing made sense, not even to themselves. It wasn't sadness exactly, not at first. It wasn't panic either. It was something in between, like their emotions were dimming, like their thoughts were losing color. Sometimes they sat on their couch in the evening, staring at the wall with the TV remote in their hand, unable to decide whether to turn it on. Sometimes they forgot to eat dinner until their hands shook. Sometimes they climbed into bed long before it was dark, not because they wanted to sleep, but because the world felt too heavy to hold up any longer. The people around them didn't notice the slow decay. They had mastered the art of appearing fine. They answered questions with practiced ease, laughed at the right moments, contributed ideas with their usual clarity. But pieces of them were slipping away quietly. They stopped reaching out to friends. They stopped replying to messages unless absolutely necessary. They stopped noticing the taste of food. They stopped taking pleasure in the things that once comforted them. Soft blankets, warm tea, the sound of rain tapping on the window, even the fog, which they once found beautiful, began to resemble the way their mind felt, heavy, obscured, blurred at the edges. Then came the morning when they stood in the shower, water streaming down their back, and realized they couldn't feel the temperature. They pressed their palm against the tile wall, feeling neither warmth nor cold, only pressure. Something about that moment frightened them in a way nothing else had. They stayed frozen under the water long after it turned lukewarm, focusing on the sensation or the lack of it. When they finally stepped out, their chest felt hollow. That day at work, everything felt too loud, too bright, too sharp. The sound of typing irritated their skin. The flickering fluorescent lights made their head throb. A coworker's laughter stabbed through their ears. During a meeting, someone asked for their opinion on a minor detail, something trivial, something they normally handled with ease, but their mind went blank. Completely blank. They stared at the person speaking, unable to process the words, unable to form thoughts. Panic curled slowly inside their stomach, rising up their spine like cold water. They muttered an apology and left the room, walking quickly to the restroom where they locked themselves in a stall and leaned against the cold metal door. They pressed their fingertips into their temples, breathing hard as their heartbeat pounded in their ears. What's happening to me? The question echoed inside their skull like a scream. They splashed water on their face, gripping the sink until their knuckles whitened, staring at the reflection in the mirror. Their eyes looked tired, unfocused, as if the person staring back at them were a stranger wearing their face. They whispered softly, "Get it together," but the words felt empty. When they returned to their desk, they noticed the world looked slightly unreal again, like they were watching everything from behind a sheet of glass. They worked mechanically through the afternoon, each task draining them further, until finally they couldn't bear it anymore. They shut down their computer, ignored the concerned look from the coworker beside them, and left early. The bus ride home felt endless. They watched raindrops trickle down the glass, merging and separating like thoughts in their mind. Each drop left a streak, a mark that disappeared into the next. Quiet. Inevitable. When they reached their stop, they stepped into the fog-thickened evening, walking slowly toward their apartment. Their legs felt heavy, as if each step required more effort than the last. The city lights glowed faintly behind the mist, blurred into smudges of color. Everything felt distant, muted, unreachable. Inside their apartment, they dropped their bag on the floor and collapsed onto the rug, sitting with their back against the couch. The silence pressed against them like a weight. They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They didn't move. They just sat there, feeling the truth finally settling into their bones. Something is wrong. And for the first time, they couldn't pretend otherwise. Hours passed without them noticing. The fog outside thickened, dimming the already faint streetlights. At some point, they pulled themselves to the desk and opened an old notebook, its pages stiff from disuse. Their hands trembled as they held the pen, the blank page staring back at them accusingly. They didn't know what to write. They didn't know how to describe the heaviness, the emptiness, the quiet terror consuming them. But after several minutes, the pen moved, slowly, haltingly. They wrote, "I think I'm disappearing." The words looked frightening in ink, permanent, true. They stared at the sentence for a long time, and then, as if something cracked inside them, they wrote more. Scribbled fears, fragmented thoughts, questions they didn't know how to answer. By the time they stopped, the fog outside had swallowed the city entirely. They closed the notebook, their breath shaky. And somewhere deep inside them, beneath the fear and confusion and numbness, something tiny stirred, something barely noticeable but undeniably there. Awareness. The first spark of understanding, the first flicker of a truth they had run from for years, the beginning of facing the mind they had never truly known. They sat there for a long time after closing the notebook, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant echo of a foghorn drifting across the bay, each sound stretching into the space around them like slow ripples in still water. And for the first time in months, They allowed themselves to simply exist without forcing clarity or pretending strength. The room felt dim, the air heavy with a kind of quiet that didn't soothe but didn't threaten either. It was the quiet that comes when a truth has finally surfaced, when a person stops running long enough for their own mind to catch up to them. They pulled their knees toward their chest, wrapping their arms around them, feeling the soft fabric of their sweater beneath their fingers as their breath moved unevenly in and out. Somewhere inside their ribs, something ached, not sharply, but deeply, as if a part of them had been waiting years for this moment of recognition, waiting to be seen, waiting to be acknowledged. They realized how long they had been hiding from themselves, how many layers of composure they had used as armor, how often they had silenced the subtle signals their mind sent them, signals that something was unraveling slowly, quietly, patiently. The exhaustion they felt now wasn't from the day, it was from years of pretending they were fine. When they finally stood, their legs felt unsteady, as if they were relearning how to live inside their own body. They wandered to the window and pressed their fingertips against the cold glass, staring out at the blurred city beyond the fog. Headlights drifted through the mist like ghostly lanterns. The outlines of buildings appeared and disappeared depending on how the wind shifted the veil of gray. It struck them then how much the fog resembled their inner world, a landscape once clear but now hidden behind layers of confusion, fear, and quiet sorrow. They whispered, barely audible even to themselves, "I don't know how to fix this." And the honesty of the words cracked something open inside them. For so long they had been afraid to even think those words, afraid that acknowledging their struggle made it real, made it undeniable. But speaking it aloud, even in the privacy of their empty apartment, brought a strange sense of relief, a release of pressure they hadn't realized was crushing them. They turned away from the window, moving toward the kitchen, their steps slow, almost hesitant. They poured a glass of water, but when they lifted it to their lips, their hands trembled slightly, and they had to set it down before spilling it. Their body was trying to tell them something their mind had ignored for too long. They exhaled shakily and leaned against the counter, closing their eyes as they forced themselves to breathe through the rising tension in their chest. They counted each inhale, each exhale, feeling the air drag against their throat like it had weight. When the trembling finally eased, they pushed themselves away from the counter and walked to the couch, sinking into the cushions with a heaviness that felt older than they were. They stared up at the ceiling, noticing the faint shadows cast by the streetlights filtering through the blinds, and wondered when exactly they had stopped caring about the small beauty of things. They used to love the way light danced across the walls, used to find comfort in the quiet patterns of their home, used to find small joys in morning routines and warm blankets and favorite songs, but now everything felt flat, muted, distant, as if their emotions were trapped behind thick glass. They reached for their phone, scrolling without purpose, through messages left unread, through notifications they couldn't bring themselves to open, through photos that reminded them of who they used to be. Someone vibrant, someone hopeful, someone alive. They stopped on a picture of themselves taken a year ago, smiling in a cafe, their eyes bright in a way that felt foreign now. A soft grief settled in their chest as they realized they didn't recognize that person anymore. They set the phone down, covering their face with their hands as a quiet sob escaped their throat. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was small, broken, exhausted. They let the tears fall, not fighting them, not trying to make them stop. The sound of their own crying startled them, as if they had forgotten they were capable of that kind of release. When the tears slowed, they wiped their cheeks and took a long, uneven breath. Their heart felt swollen, tender, raw. And yet beneath all that rawness, there was something else, something fragile but real, a tiny flicker of desire to understand what was happening inside them, to turn toward the darkness instead of running from it. They whispered into the quiet, "I need help," though there was no one there to hear it. The admission hung in the air like a truth finally freed. They stared at the notebook across the room, the one holding the sentence that started everything tonight. It felt like a doorway into a part of their mind they had never entered, a part filled with forgotten feelings, buried memories, unanswered questions. They didn't move toward it again. They didn't have the strength tonight. Instead, they pulled the blanket over their body and curled into the corner of the couch, letting the softness cradle them. Their eyes drifted closed, their breath still uneven but slowing, their mind still heavy but quieting just enough for sleep to find them. And as they slipped into the fragile edge of unconsciousness, one final thought drifted gently through the fog of their mind. Maybe this is the beginning of finding myself. They woke the next morning wrapped in the same hollow stillness that had carried them into sleep, the kind of stillness that doesn't soothe, but instead clings to the ribs like cold fog, reminding them that nothing inside had truly lifted during the night. They blinked slowly, staring at the ceiling as the muted gray daylight crept across it, their minds still heavy, their bodies still sluggish, as if they had sunk into some deep emotional sediment that held them tight. For a long time they didn't move. They simply lay there listening to the faint hum of the heater, the occasional distant call of a gull somewhere near the bay, the delicate tapping of condensation dripping from the window frame. Each sound felt distant, muffled, as though reaching them from behind a wall. Eventually they pushed themselves upright, feeling the stiffness in their limbs, the exhaustion in their eyes, and the strange ache behind their sternum that had started weeks ago and hadn't left since. They shuffled to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and stared blankly at their reflection while the water warmed. Their face looked unfamiliar, not in shape, not in features, but in expression, as if their own eyes were slowly forgetting how to carry light. They splashed water onto their face, hoping it would wake something inside them, but the numbness remained like a shadow that refused to shift. The shower steam fogged the mirror, blurring the outline of their reflection, and for a moment they felt relieved not to see themselves clearly. They moved through their morning routine more slowly than usual, each movement feeling slightly detached from intention, as though their body were performing out of habit rather than direction. The coffee tasted weak, even though it was brewed the same way. The sound of the spoon stirring against the ceramic mug felt too loud. By the time they stepped outside, the fog was thick enough to turn the street into a soft, ghostly corridor. They wrapped their coat tightly around them as they walked toward the bus stop, the mist brushing against their cheeks like cold breath. The morning commuters around them moved with mechanical determination, their footsteps muffled on the damp pavement, their faces pale in the pale light. The bus arrived with its usual hiss of brakes, and they climbed aboard, taking their usual seat by the window. They rested their forehead against the cool glass and watched the blurred scenery slide by as silhouettes of buildings, half-visible road signs, headlights appearing like floating orbs. Their thoughts drifted the way the fog drifted, slow, heavy, without clear direction. They felt an emptiness inside them that frightened them, but the fear itself was muted, distant, as if wrapped in cotton. At the office, they walked in with the same quiet greeting as always, but even their voice sounded different to their own ears, softer, thinner, like it could shatter if they spoke too loudly. Their desk greeted them with its familiar clutter. Notes, pens, half-finished drafts, a mug still stained from yesterday's coffee. They sat and opened their laptop, watching the screen glow to life, but instead of feeling the usual tension of needing to produce, needing to perform, needing to prove their worth in every task, they felt nothing. Just a blankness that sank deeper the longer they stared. Emails piled one after another, small red notifications blinking like warnings, but their mind couldn't process the urgency. It all felt so distant, so meaningless, so impossibly far from the reality of what was happening inside their body. Their coworkers chatted nearby, their voices rising and falling like waves in shallow water. Someone laughed loudly. Someone complained about deadlines. Someone dropped a pen. All these sounds normally blended into the white noise of the office, but today each one felt strangely sharp, pressing against the thin shell of their concentration. They tried to focus. They typed a few words, deleted them, typed again, deleted again. Time passed without feeling like time. Moments stretched and collapsed in uneven rhythms. Around midday, a coworker asked if they wanted to join for lunch, and they mustered the energy for a polite smile and said maybe next time, even though they already knew next time would be the same. They watched the group leave, their laughter fading down the hallway, and felt a heaviness settle onto their shoulders. They knew they were withdrawing, but they didn't know how to stop. The afternoon dragged. Their stomach growled, reminding them they hadn't eaten, but the thought of food felt overwhelming, as though chewing and swallowing required emotional strength they didn't possess. Their hands trembled slightly on the keyboard. A headache pulsed behind their eyes. At some point, their manager stopped by, placing a gentle hand on the back of their chair and asking if everything was all right. They forced the corners of their mouth upward and nodded, hearing themselves lie with practiced ease. The manager smiled, accepted the lie without question, and moved on. As soon as they were gone, the smile fell from their face like it had never belonged there. At 4 p.m., the office lights flickered on as the sky outside darkened. They sat staring at their reflection in the monitor, faint and ghost-like, superimposed over spreadsheets and emails. The reflection startled them. They looked like someone fading. Eventually, they shut their laptop and left without saying goodbye to anyone, pulling their coat around them as they stepped back into the thick evening fog. They walked slowly, their breath visible in the cold air. The city was quiet, softened by mist. Streetlights glowed like faint halos. Cars passed like blurred shadows. They felt invisible, a ghost moving through a world too dense to move out of their way. When they reached home, they didn't turn on the lights right away. The dimness felt safer, softer. They slipped off their coat and let it fall to the floor, too tired to hang it properly. They walked to the window and watched the fog pressing against the glass, illuminated by the muted orange glow of the street lamp outside. Their breath made small clouds on the surface. They placed their palm flat against it and felt the cold seep into their skin. The quiet inside their apartment was louder tonight. They sat on the couch, tucking their legs underneath them, and stared at nothing. The silence pressed harder, filling the space between their ribs, making breathing feel heavier. Eventually, they reached for their notebook, the same one from the night before, and opened it to the page where they had written, "I think I'm disappearing." The words looked darker now, sharper. They traced the letters with the tip of their finger. Without thinking much, they began writing again. The pen glided shakily but urgently, pouring out words they had held in their chest for too long. Thoughts about numbness, about fear, about exhaustion so deep it felt physical, about the way their mind drifted away from them at random moments, about not recognizing themselves, about feeling like they were dissolving into the fog that surrounded their city. They wrote about wanting to be okay but not knowing how, about wanting to ask for help but not knowing who to trust, about feeling like their life was happening to someone else. The more they wrote, the more their breath trembled until tears blurred the ink. They let out a quiet, shaky sound, not quite a sob, but the sound of something inside giving way. They wrote until their hand cramped and the page was full, then flipped to the next and continued, desperate to empty their mind onto paper, desperate to understand what this slow collapse meant. When they finally stopped, their body felt weak, their throat sore, their cheeks damp. They closed the notebook gently, as though afraid to disturb the truths inside it. They leaned back against the couch cushions and exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of everything they had written settle around them. And in that moment, raw, exhausted, trembling, they whispered something that frightened them as much as it relieved them. "I'm not okay." The words echoed softly through the dim room, but this time, instead of drowning in fear, they felt something else beneath the confession. A tiny, fragile, trembling spark of honesty that felt like the first true breath they had taken in months. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the heaviness and the fog and the fatigue, a small voice whispered back with surprising clarity, "You're finally telling the truth." They woke the next morning with the unmistakable heaviness of emotional exhaustion pulling them downward, a heaviness so deep it felt like gravity had doubled overnight and settled entirely inside their chest. Even before opening their eyes, they knew the day would begin with the same quiet struggle as yesterday, the same dull ache behind their ribs, the same fog drifting through their thoughts like an endless gray tide washing away any sense of clarity they might have had the night before. They lay in bed for several minutes, staring at the faint outline of their window as the pale morning light seeped through the fog outside, washing the room in a colorless glow that made everything look slightly faded. Their limbs felt weighted, their throat dry, their mind still tangled with the residue of the emotions they had spilled into their notebook. When they finally forced themselves to sit up, they felt the stiffness in their shoulders, the tightness in their jaw, the quiet tremor in their hands. Small details they had ignored for too long, small signals that had been whispering for months that something inside them was slowly fracturing. They went through their morning routine in silence, moving with the sluggishness of someone wading through cold water. The coffee tasted even blander than yesterday. The steam rising from the mug blurred their vision, and they stared into it with numb eyes, feeling strangely disconnected from the world around them. They noticed that they hadn't felt excited about anything in weeks. Not work, not hobbies, not days off, not even the comfort of coming home. Everything had become a series of tasks to complete, moments to survive, hours to endure. The realization stung, but only faintly, like touching the edge of an old bruise. As they walked to the bus stop, the fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the streetlights whole, leaving only pale halos of light hovering in the gray air. Their footsteps echoed softly on the damp pavement, and for a moment they wondered if anyone would notice if they simply kept walking past the stop, past the familiar route, past the routine that clung to their life like a rigid frame. But as the bus approached, its headlights glowing dimly through the mist, they stepped forward automatically, boarding without thought. The interior was warm but smelled faintly of damp jackets and lingering exhaustion. They sat by the window again, forehead resting against the cool glass, watching the city slide by in blurred shapes. Their mind drifted, not peacefully, not freely, but in a slow, unsteady sway. Thoughts surfaced like distant echoes. Why am I like this? Why can't I feel present? When did I last feel joy? Do people know how much I'm struggling? Does anyone care? Do I even care? Those questions floated inside them like shadows with no shape, heavy but undefined. They clenched their hands in their lap, grounding themselves in the pressure of their fingers pressing into their palms. When they arrived at the office, they noticed immediately how loud everything felt today. Louder than usual, sharper, almost unbearable. The printer hummed in the corner. Keyboards clicked with frantic speed. Someone was complaining about a late file. Someone else was arguing quietly over the phone. All these normal sounds pressed against their skull until their thoughts felt scrambled. They sat at their desk, hands hovering over the keyboard, eyes already burning with fatigue. Their inbox flashed with new emails. Their calendar chimed reminders. Projects were piling up. Deadlines tightening, expectations growing heavier. They felt the panic rising, that familiar trembling, that cold rush up their spine. that tightening in their throat. But they swallowed it, pushing it down like they always did. But today, pushing it down didn't work. They tried to focus, tried to type, tried to force productivity the way they always had, but their vision began to blur. Their breath grew shallow. Their heart thudded unevenly. The pressure behind their eyes became unbearable. They stood abruptly, the chairs scraping loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of a few coworkers who looked up with surprise. They muttered something about needing air and walked quickly to the stairwell, pushing the door open with more force than necessary. Inside, the stairwell was cold, quiet, dimly lit by a flickering bulb that cast long shadows along the concrete steps. They leaned against the wall, pressing a palm against their chest, trying to calm the frantic pounding of their heart. Their breath came in shaky bursts, and they closed their eyes tightly, trying to ground themselves. The silence pressed around them, broken only by the faint hum of electricity. They whispered to themselves, voice trembling, "Please stop, please stop." Not sure if they were pleading with their mind or their body or the entire world. They felt the panic rise higher, pressing against their ribs like a wave threatening to crash. But then, unexpectedly, something inside them shifted. A thought surfaced slowly, like a tiny light flickering through darkness. What if I don't fight it this time? They opened their eyes, inhaling shakily, and let the panic move through them instead of pushing it away. They felt the racing heartbeat, the trembling limbs, the tightness in their chest, but they didn't argue with any of it. They simply observed. And to their shock, the panic softened just slightly, just enough for them to breathe a little deeper. They slid down the wall until they were sitting on the cold concrete floor, pulling their knees to their chest, resting their forehead against them. The coolness of the floor seeped through their clothes, grounding them in a strange way. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt strange in that quiet stairwell. Stretched, suspended, heavy. Eventually their breath steadied somewhat. Their hearts slowed. Their hands stopped shaking. They sat there in the half-dark, feeling strangely emptied out, hollow but calm. When they finally stood, their legs felt unsteady, but their mind felt not clear, but quieter. As they walked back to their desk, they avoided everyone's eyes, afraid someone would notice the fragility clinging to them like damp clothes. But no one looked too closely. They sat in their chair and stared at their screen, unable to focus on work but unable to leave. They clicked through emails without reading them, watched the cursor blink on a blank document, listened to the faint tapping of keyboards around them. At some point they opened a browser tab and searched things they had never dared to search before once. Words like burnout, emotional numbness, disconnection, depression, anxiety, dissociation, mental fog. Each article they clicked seemed to reflect pieces of them back at them, pieces they had been too afraid to name. They closed the tab quickly whenever someone walked by, pretending to be working, but inside something had shifted. For the first time, they admitted there might be a name for what they were experiencing, and that naming felt both terrifying and relieving. When the workday finally ended, they stepped outside into the damp evening air, letting the cold mist cling to their skin. They felt drained, their limbs heavy as they walked toward the waterfront. Something drew them there, maybe the fog, maybe the quiet, maybe the way the water seemed to understand heaviness. They sat on a bench overlooking the bay, pulling their coat tighter around them, watching the lights of distant boats flicker through the haze. The city felt distant from this vantage point, quieter, softer, almost gentle. And in that gentleness, their emotions loosened. They felt tears rising again, but this time, they didn't fight them. They let them fall silently, each tear warm against their cold cheeks. They whispered into the mist, "I don't know how much more I can carry." And the honesty in the words made their chest tighten. But beneath that tightness, beneath the ache, beneath the despair, there was something else, something small, something quiet, something persistent. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of awareness, the beginning of turning inward instead of away, the beginning of learning the language of their own suffering. That night, after returning home, they lit a candle and opened their notebook again, flipping past the heavy pages written the night before. They began writing slowly at first, then faster, then desperately. They wrote about the panic in the stairwell. They wrote about the numbness, the fog, the fear. They wrote about losing interest in everything. They wrote about feeling hollow, tired, disconnected. They wrote about the terror of disappearing into themselves. And then, unexpectedly, they wrote a sentence that made their breath catch. Maybe my mind is asking me to listen. The moment they saw the words, something inside them softened. For the first time, they realized their collapse might not be punishment. It might be communication, a signal, a plea. They set the pen down slowly, staring at the sentence until the candle flicker made the ink tremble. And deep inside them, beneath layers of exhaustion and fear, a small clarity whispered, "I am trying to understand myself." They didn't realize how long they had been sitting on the floor with the open notebook beside them until their legs began tingling from lack of circulation, a slow, prickling sensation traveling up their calves like a reminder that time was still moving even when they weren't. They stretched their legs out carefully, wincing slightly as feeling returned, and looked around their dimly lit apartment, noticing for the first time how still everything felt. The untouched dishes near the sink, the blanket tossed haphazardly across the back of the couch, the faint shimmering of candlelight flickering against the wall as if trying to soften the heaviness of the room. The air smelled faintly of wax and damp fog carried inside on their coat earlier, and when they inhaled deeply, the mix of scents grounded them more than they expected. They pushed themselves upright slowly, feeling a dull ache travel through their spine, a reminder of how tense their body had been for weeks, maybe months. They walked to the window and watched droplets of condensation slide down the glass like tiny silver trails, the outside world still drenched in fog, the distant harbor lights glowing softly in blurred halos. Their reflection hovered faintly on the surface, faint, tired, but undeniably there. They lifted their fingers and traced the outline of their reflection's face, feeling a strange tenderness toward the person staring back at them, as if they were seeing their own suffering clearly for the first time instead of criticizing it. "You're trying," they whispered softly, unexpectedly, the sentence slipping out before they could think about it. It felt strange to speak gently to their own reflection, but the words carried truth. They were trying, surviving, listening, writing, showing up even when they felt like falling apart. They pulled their hand away and stepped back, rubbing their arms as a chill ran through them. The apartment felt colder somehow, as if the fog outside had seeped through the walls and settled beneath their skin. They wrapped a blanket around their shoulders and walked slowly to the couch, sinking into the cushions. Their mind drifted again, but this time, rather than sliding helplessly into numbness, their thoughts formed something like a fragile clarity. They replayed the moment in the stairwell, the panic that had nearly swallowed them, and the surprising calm that followed when they chose not to fight it. They wondered if that tiny shift meant something. If maybe the panic wasn't a monster but a signal. Maybe the mind wasn't trying to destroy them. Maybe it was begging for them to stop pretending. Their gaze drifted back to the notebook lying open on the floor. The sentence, "Maybe my mind is asking me to listen," glowing in their memory like a soft lantern in darkness. The more they thought about it, the more the idea took root. They had spent years pushing through everything, pushing through sadness, pushing through exhaustion, pushing through fear, pushing through disappointment, as if their worth depended on their ability to remain unshaken. They had treated emotions like inconveniences, thoughts like enemies, weakness like failure. But what if the collapse wasn't weakness? What if it was exhaustion? What if it was the natural consequence of ignoring themselves for too long? They curled deeper into the blanket, letting the thought settle. Outside, the foghorn echoed again, a low, haunting sound that vibrated faintly through the window pane, making them feel both small and connected to something larger. They closed their eyes and breathed in sync with the distant hum, letting the sound guide their breath. When they opened their eyes, the room felt slightly less oppressive. Not brighter, not lighter, but less suffocating, as if acknowledging their inner struggles had created a small pocket of air inside the heaviness. They stood slowly, stretching their arms overhead, feeling joints pop softly. On instinct, they walked into the kitchen and filled a pot with water, setting it on the stove. They didn't have much appetite, but the idea of something warm felt comforting. As the water heated, they leaned against the counter and stared at the silent refrigerator door, noticing small magnets, old photos, faint reminders of better seasons. One photo caught their eye, a picture of them standing on a pier last summer, sunlight bright on their face, their smile unforced. They lifted the photo gently, their thumb brushing across the edge. They didn't remember feeling that light, but they trusted the camera more than their memory. "Where did you go?" they whispered to the version of themselves in the picture. But the more they stared at it, the more another truth surfaced. Maybe that version of them hadn't disappeared. Maybe it had been buried beneath layers of fear, expectation, pressure, and silence. Maybe it was still somewhere inside, waiting. The kettle whistled softly behind them, and they blinked, returning to the present. They poured hot water into a mug with a tea bag, watching the color bloom slowly through the water like ink spreading across paper. They carried it back to the couch, cupping the warm ceramic in both hands, letting the heat seep into their palms. For a while, they simply sat, sipping slowly, breathing evenly, listening to the quiet. And then gently, for the first time in a long while, they whispered into the stillness, "I don't want to disappear." It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't said with force or urgency. It was soft, almost trembling, but it was true. And in saying it, they realized something. They wanted to understand their mind. They wanted to heal. They wanted to stay. And wanting was the first step toward coming back to themselves. They woke the next morning with the sense that something inside them had shifted ever so slightly, not enough to feel better, not enough to feel stronger, but just enough to feel different. A subtle change like a thin crack of light appearing beneath a shut door, faint but present, real enough to make them pause before getting out of bed. They lay there staring at the ceiling as the gray morning seeped in, listening to the soft drip of condensation from the window, the distant hum of the foghorn, and the quiet creaking of the old building settling into the cold. Their chest still felt heavy, their limbs still tired, their minds still wrapped in layers of fog, but beneath all that was a strange, fragile awareness that hadn't been there before. An awareness of their own mind as something separate from the thoughts drifting through it. They sat up slowly, rubbing their palms against their face, feeling the warmth of their skin beneath their fingertips, grounding themselves in the sensation. The kitchen felt colder today, the floor tiles like ice beneath their bare feet, the air carrying a faint chill from the night before. They made tea instead of coffee, seeking warmth without the sharp rush of caffeine that their trembling nerves had grown to fear. As the water boiled, they leaned against the counter and watched steam rise from the kettle, curling softly in the still air. Something about the quiet movement of the steam held their attention. Gentle, fluid, unforced. They envied its simplicity. When they stepped outside to walk toward the bus stop, the fog was thicker than usual, swallowing entire buildings and turning streetlights into floating orbs. Their breath formed pale clouds in front of them. The world felt muted, softened, almost dreamlike. And for the first time, they didn't feel frightened by the fog. Instead, they felt strangely connected to it, as if the world now mirrored the haziness inside their mind, making their internal storm feel a little less isolating. On the bus, they rested their head against the cold glass and let the rhythmic motion soothe their frayed thoughts. They watched droplets of moisture form on the window and slide downward in uneven paths, some merging, some splitting, some disappearing. The movement reminded them of how their own thoughts had begun to behave, and drifting, merging, unraveling. Work felt heavier today. Every sound, keyboards, footsteps, distant conversations is pressed against their nerves like a too tight band around their skull. They answered emails in slow motion, rereading each sentence multiple times. Their chests tightened when their manager assigned new tasks. And though they nodded calmly, inside they felt the familiar tremor of fear rising again. But beneath that fear was something else. The echo of the sentence they wrote last night, "Maybe my mind is asking me to listen." The sentence repeated itself softly in the back of their mind, not soothing the anxiety but giving it shape, giving it meaning. Instead of seeing their emotional fog as a failure, they began to see it as a message, a warning signal, a plea for rest, a call to attention. That realization didn't make the workday easier, but it made the heaviness feel less like a personal flaw and more like a symptom of a deeper truth. Around midday, their coworker approached them with a question, but as they tried to answer, their vision blurred slightly and the world began to feel unreal again, as if they were watching everything through a thick pane of glass. Their heart rate spiked. Their palms grew damp. The sense of dissociation wrapped around them like a cold veil. Panic rose quickly. They excused themselves and walked to the restroom, gripping the edge of the sink as their breath came fast and shallow. For a moment, they feared the panic would consume them again like it had in the stairwell yesterday, but then, trembling, sweating, heart racing, they remembered what had happened in the stairwell. The moment they had stopped fighting the panic and simply felt it. They closed their eyes and let their awareness drop into their body. They noticed the pounding heart, the tight chest, the trembling fingers, the heat rising in their face, and instead of spiraling, they whispered internally, "I'm here. I feel it. I'm here." The panic didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. They stayed with the sensations until they softened into something less overwhelming. And for the first time, they realized they were capable of surviving these moments without collapsing into fear. When they returned to their desk, they felt exhausted but strangely proud, a quiet pride that warmed their heart for one brief moment before fading into the usual heaviness. After work, they didn't go straight home. Instead, they walked to a small park near the waterfront, drawn by the sound of waves lapping against the rocks. They sat on a bench near an old tree whose branches stretched outward like tired arms, the leaves dripping with condensation. The air smelled of salt and wet earth. They sat in silence, breathing slowly, letting the fog circle around them like a heavy blanket. Being outside near the water always made them feel both small and connected, as if the ocean held room for all the emotions they didn't know how to carry. As they stared at the shifting gray waves, memories began surfacing, not in vivid flashes, but in soft, faded fragments that drifted through their mind like mist. They remembered being younger, sitting alone at their childhood desk doing homework while the house buzzed with noise they felt too overwhelmed to join. They remembered wanting to cry but swallowing it down because crying felt like failure. They remembered being praised for being responsible, strong, mature, long before they truly understood what those words meant. They remembered how every piece of praise became pressure, how every compliment felt like another layer of expectations laid across their shoulders. They remembered learning to hide their emotions because showing them felt dangerous, too vulnerable, too messy, too disappointing. And now, sitting on the bench watching fog drift across the water, they felt the weight of those memories not as pain, but as understanding. They whispered to themselves, "No wonder I feel this way." and a quiet wave of compassion washed through them. When they returned home that evening, they lit a candle again, its warm glow softening the room. They brewed tea, wrapped a blanket around their shoulders, and opened their notebook. Their handwriting shook slightly as they began to write, but the words came easier tonight. They wrote about the panic in the restroom, how they had stayed with it instead of running. They wrote about the fog on the bus, how it had made them feel less alone. They wrote about the memories that had surfaced at the park, the childhood expectations, the loneliness, and then, unexpectedly, they wrote something new. Maybe I'm not broken. Maybe I'm overwhelmed. The sentence settled into them like a stone dropped gently into deep water, sinking slowly but leaving ripples that reached every corner of their inner world. They sat with that idea for a long time, feeling its truth settle deeper into their bones. The collapse wasn't a flaw. It wasn't failure. It wasn't weakness. It was exhaustion. It was years of silence. It was repressed emotions resurfacing. It was their mind reaching its limit and begging to be seen. They closed the notebook, holding it gently against their chest, and let the warmth of the candle wash over them. And in that soft glow, with the weight of the day still heavy inside them, they whispered a sentence they had never spoken before. I want to understand my mind, not fight it. And somewhere deep within them, beneath all the fog and fear and exhaustion, something answered back with quiet certainty. Then keep listening. They sat for a long time with the notebook pressed against their chest, feeling the warmth of the candle flicker across their skin and the heaviness of the day settle into the deepest layers of their body. And the longer they sat, the more they became aware of subtle sensations they had never noticed before. The faint buzzing in their limbs from exhaustion, the soft throb behind their temples where tension had lived for weeks, the fluttery feeling in their stomach that they once mistook for hunger but now recognized as a quiet anxiety living just beneath their ribs. All these sensations had been there for months, maybe longer, but they had been drowning them in distraction, ignoring every whisper from their body in the name of being strong, in the name of being reliable, in the name of being everything everyone needed them to be. And now, for the first time, they were letting their body speak, not loudly, not desperately, but honestly. They placed a hand on their chest, right over their heartbeat, feeling it thump steadily against their palm. And for a moment, the simple rhythm made their eyes sting with sudden emotion. It was a reminder that their body had been fighting for them the entire time, breathing for them, carrying them, holding them. Even when their mind was drowning in fog, they whispered, "I'm sorry," barely audible, as if apologizing to their own heart for ignoring it for so long. The apology brought an unexpected wave of sadness, not sharp or overwhelming, but deep and quiet, like standing in an empty room where a long-forgotten memory suddenly resurfaces. They let the sadness move through them, not resisting, not analyzing, simply allowing it to exist. When the emotion softened, they set the notebook aside gently, as though setting down something fragile, and leaned back into the couch, letting the blanket cocoon them. Outside, the foghorn echoed again, its low hum vibrating faintly through the wall and grounding them in the present moment like an anchor. They listened to the foghorn the way one might listen to a reminder, steady, patient, unhurried. Their breath synced with its rhythm without them realizing it. And somewhere in that gentle sync, something inside them loosened. They stood and walked toward the kitchen, filling their glass with water, watching it swirl as they lifted it. Their hands were steadier now, though the tiredness still clung to their limbs. They sipped slowly, feeling the coolness travel down their throat, refreshing in a way they hadn't felt in days. Then they walked to the balcony door, not to go outside, but to stand close enough that the cold air leaking through the edges touched their face. The night was too foggy to see the harbor clearly, but the soft glow of distant lights shimmered through the mist, in faint circles. They pressed their forehead to the glass, eyes half closed, and breathed deeply, letting the coolness soothe their warmed skin. Thoughts began drifting again, but this time differently. Not chaotic, not overwhelming, but reflective. They remembered moments from the past few years that they had brushed aside too quickly in their rush to meet deadlines, fulfill responsibilities, and uphold the image of competence. They remembered nights when they cried silently in bed because their chest felt too tight. They remembered mornings when they felt dread before even opening their eyes. They remembered afternoons when social interactions drained them so deeply they needed hours alone to feel like themselves again. At the time, they had dismissed these moments as normal stress, convincing themselves they were simply tired or overthinking. But now, standing in the dim light of their apartment, forehead pressed gently against the cold glass, they saw those moments clearly. Not as isolated incidents, but as signs, as red flags waving desperately for their attention. They whispered to themselves, "I missed so many warnings as a cafre." And the truth of the sentence settled into their bones like a quiet ache. But instead of feeling guilt, they felt compassion. How could they have known? No one had taught them how to listen to their mind. No one had shown them how to understand the language of their own emotions. No one had told them that strength didn't come from holding everything together, but from knowing when to collapse gently. They closed their eyes and let their shoulders slump, releasing tension they hadn't realized they were holding. When they opened their eyes again, they noticed how empty the apartment felt. Not in a lonely way, but in a way that mirrored how their internal world had been cleared of pretense over the last days. It felt like a blank space waiting to be filled with something new, something softer, something honest. They returned to the couch and picked up the notebook again, flipping through the pages filled with raw confessions and trembling handwriting. They could see their own emotional timeline written across them. The denial, the numbness, the fear, the panic, the tiny sparks of awareness beginning to break through like thin threads of light. They felt a strange tenderness rise in their chest as they realized how brave these pages were, even if they didn't feel brave while writing them. They turned to a fresh page and placed the pen against it, hesitating only for a moment before writing a new sentence. "I want to meet myself." They stared at the sentence with a mixture of disbelief and longing. Wanting to meet themselves felt like the most vulnerable desire they had ever acknowledged, but it also felt like the first step toward something real, something sustainable, something healing. After writing it, they closed the notebook and placed it gently on the table. Then they wrapped the blanket tighter around their body and leaned back, letting the cushion hold their weight. Their eyes drifted to the ceiling, tracing the faint shadows cast by the candlelight. For the first time tonight, they didn't feel afraid of their thoughts. They didn't feel like their mind was an enemy waiting to ambush them. Instead, their mind felt like a wounded companion, scared, exhausted, misunderstood, but still trying, still reaching, still sending signals in the only ways it knew how. They whispered softly, "I'm listening." And the room felt different after the words left their mouth. Lighter, calmer, as if the air itself shifted around them. They didn't know what listening to their mind would look like. They didn't know where this journey was heading. They didn't know if they would feel better tomorrow or worse. But for the first time in a long time, they felt present. They felt awake. They felt connected to themselves. They curled into the blanket and let their eyes fall close, the candle flickering its last few seconds before extinguishing into darkness. And as they drifted into sleep, they carried one final quiet thought with them. Maybe the collapse wasn't the end. Maybe it was the doorway. They woke the next morning with a different kind of heaviness, not the suffocating weight that had pinned them to the mattress for weeks, but a quieter, more grounded heaviness, as if their body were finally acknowledging how much it had been holding without collapsing under it. They lay there for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the stale coolness of the early fog drift across the floor through the cracked window, listening to the distant rumble of a ferry engine and the low hum of the foghorn echoing across the water. They blinked up at the ceiling, noticing faint shadows shifting as the soft gray light seeped deeper into the room, and for the first time in a long while, they felt a subtle curiosity settle inside them. A quiet wondering about what their mind would show them today, not with dread, but with a tender awareness. When they finally sat up, their muscles protested with a dull ache, but it was the kind of ache that made them feel real, connected to their own body rather than drifting outside of it. They wrapped their blanket around their shoulders and walked slowly to the bathroom, catching their reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, messy hair, pale skin, but something else too. Softness. Not healing, not yet, but softness in the way they looked at themselves, as if they were no longer studying their reflection with judgment, but with a kind of compassionate curiosity. They splashed warm water on their face, feeling the shock of heat against their cheeks, grounding them in a way they hadn't expected. In the kitchen, they brewed tea again. They had quietly realized that coffee made their heart race in ways they couldn't handle anymore, and they leaned against the counter, watching the amber color swirl as the tea steeped. The steam rose slowly, drifting upward like a thin veil, and something about its gentleness made their chest loosen. When they stepped outside, the fog wrapped around the neighborhood like a soft blanket, muting the world into shades of gray and silver. Their boots tapped quietly on the damp pavement as they walked toward the bus stop. And for once, the quiet didn't feel ominous. It felt peaceful. They boarded the bus and sat by the window as always, but today they didn't rest their head against the glass. They sat upright, watching the world blur past, noticing small details they had missed for months. The way raindrops slid in straight lines before drifting sideways when the bus turned. The way a cyclist pedaled slowly through the mist. The way a woman at a crosswalk bundled her child in a bright yellow raincoat. The world felt like it was moving at their pace for the first time. At work, they braced themselves for the usual flood of noise, but when they walked through the doors, the sounds didn't hit them as sharply. The chatter, the printers, the footsteps, everything felt slightly more distant, as if there were a thin layer of space between their mind and the environment. They took their seat, opened their laptop, and breathed deeply before beginning. Their inbox was overflowing again, tasks waiting, messages unanswered, the usual storm. But instead of panicking, they whispered inwardly, one thing at a time, and to their surprise, their body followed the instruction. They answered one email, then another, then a third, not fast, not seamlessly, but steadily. And every few minutes, when their chest tightened or their vision softened into fog, they paused, placed a hand over their heart, or pressed their feet firmly into the ground and breathed until the soft awareness returned. In the afternoon, something unexpected happened. A coworker noticed they seemed calmer and asked quietly if they had changed something lately. For a brief moment, panic sparked. The instinct to hide, to lie, to say everything was fine, but instead of shrinking into old patterns, they inhaled, softened their jaw, and said something honest but simple. "I'm trying to understand myself more lately." The coworker nodded, surprised but respectful, and didn't push further. That small moment, they speaking truth without fear, felt like a door clicking open in their chest. After work, they didn't rush home like they usually did. Instead, they walked slowly through the city, letting the cool air brush against their cheeks, letting the fog cling to their coat, letting the distant headlights glow like soft halos. The streets were quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that made them feel like the world had softened just for them. They walked with no destination, just listening to the rhythm of their footsteps, the whisper of their breath, the steady beat of their heart. Eventually, they ended up near the waterfront again, drawn by the familiar sound of waves lapping against the rocks. They sat on a bench overlooking the bay, pulling their coat tighter around their body as the wind picked up. The water was dark, rippling with gentle movement, reflecting the hazy glow of the distant port lights. As they watched the waves, thoughts began surfacing, but they didn't drown in them. They observed them the way someone might observe clouds drifting across a sky. They noticed thoughts about work, about expectations, about loneliness, about fear. They noticed memories resurfacing, old conversations, childhood disappointments, moments when they had felt invisible, unimportant, unseen. But instead of pushing them away, they whispered internally, "I see you." And something incredible happened. The thoughts softened. The memories loosened. The anxiety dulled, not gone, not fixed, but held, supported, understood. They leaned back on the bench, closing their eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of salt water and wet concrete. A strange warmth bloomed in their chest. Not joy, but relief. They whispered softly into the night, "Maybe I don't have to fight myself all the time." And the realization almost made them cry. When they returned home, the apartment felt different, not brighter, but less heavy. As if the fog inside had shifted slightly, they changed into soft clothes, lit a candle, and sat cross-legged on the floor with their notebook. Unlike the previous nights when they wrote out of desperation or panic, tonight they wrote with curiosity. They wrote about the bus ride, the softness, the co-worker's question, the bench near the water. They wrote about the moments when they felt steady, even if only for seconds. They wrote about listening to their thoughts. They wrote about the possibility of being their own companion. And then they wrote something they hadn't expected. "Maybe I can learn to live with my mind instead of against it." The sentence felt like a revelation. They set the pen down and let the words sink into them. Their breath steadied. Their shoulders softened. They leaned back on their hands, staring at the candle flame flickering in the quiet room. And for the first time since their slow collapse began, they felt the faint, trembling beginning of something they thought they had lost forever: hope. They woke the next morning with a softness in their chest that startled them. Not a dramatic lightness or sudden joy, but a gentle, unfamiliar warmth, like the first touch of sunlight after a long winter, subtle enough to question whether it was real, but undeniable in the way it settled between their ribs. They sat up slowly, blinking in the muted morning glow that filtered through the fog outside, and realized that for the first time in months, the heaviness didn't immediately crush them upon waking. It was still there. The tiredness, the vulnerability, the ache of their inner work. But it no longer felt like a weight they had to drag through the day. Instead, it felt like something they could hold, something manageable, something known. They made tea and leaned against the counter as it steeped, watching the colors bloom through the water, feeling their breath sink naturally with the warmth rising from the mug. When they stepped outside, the fog was thicker than ever, turning the entire street into a shifting gray tunnel. But instead of feeling swallowed by it, they felt strangely comforted, almost protected by the anonymity it offered, as if the world too was moving slowly and thoughtfully. The bus was quiet, half empty, and they sat near the window again, but this time they didn't use the cold glass as an anchor. Instead, they watched the fog swirl around streetlights and drift across rooftops, noticing how even the world seemed to breathe with them. At work, they felt a delicate steadiness in their movements. Not confidence, not certainty, but presence. When their manager called them in to discuss a mistake in a recent project, they felt the familiar spark of panic flare inside them, but instead of spiraling, they inhaled and listened. They acknowledged the error without self-destruction, apologized sincerely, and asked clear questions about how to fix it. Their manager seemed almost surprised by the calmness, offering positive guidance instead of criticism. When they left the office afterward, they felt a pulse of quiet pride in their chest, a recognition that they had handled something that once would have shattered them. Later in the day, a coworker approached them with a gentle concern. "You really seem different lately. Softer, stronger. Are you doing okay?" For the first time in a long time, they didn't lie. They didn't deflect. They didn't minimize. They simply said, "I'm working on understanding myself." And the coworker smiled with genuine warmth. That small exchange felt monumental, not because someone noticed the change, but because they had spoken truth without fear. After work, instead of walking aimlessly or collapsing into exhaustion, they felt a pull toward the water, toward the familiar rhythm of waves that had quietly held their secrets for weeks. They walked slowly, feeling the cold air brush against their cheeks, listening to the distant rumble of the harbor. When they reached the waterfront, they sat on the same bench beneath the old tree, feeling its quiet presence behind them like an elder that had witnessed countless storms. The fog hung thick over the bay, turning the lights of distant boats into soft floating halos. The waves rolled gently, each one carrying a reflective calm. They breathed deeply, letting the air fill their lungs, and for the first time in ages they felt themselves. Not the broken version, not the collapsing version, not the disappearing version, but the version that was rebuilding quietly from the inside out. Thoughts drifted through their mind, but none carried the sharp sting they once had. Memories surfaced. Childhood moments, old loneliness, buried pressures. But instead of overwhelming them, these memories felt like puzzle pieces sliding into place. They whispered softly, "I understand." Not sure if they were speaking to their younger self or their current one. They sat for a long time watching the fog shift like a living veil across the water, feeling the quiet transformation happening inside them. Slow, deep, real. They didn't feel healed, but they felt whole in a way they had never expected. On their walk home, they noticed their breath again. Slow, steady, grounded. Their footsteps felt lighter, not because the world had changed, but because they were no longer carrying themselves with the tightness of someone fighting their own existence. Their apartment felt warmer when they stepped inside, as if the space itself recognized their shift. They lit a candle and sat cross-legged on the floor, notebook open. And this time when they wrote, their handwriting flowed with purpose, with clarity, with truth. They wrote about the softness in the morning, about the steadiness at work, about the moment of calm at the bench. They wrote about panic that softened instead of swallowing them. They wrote about awareness that grew instead of shrinking. They wrote about the slow, painful, beautiful process of meeting themselves in the places they once feared the most. And then, with a breath that trembled slightly, they wrote, "I no longer fear my mind." When they saw the words on the page, something inside them released. A quiet unraveling, not of collapse, but of tension. They leaned back, letting tears slip down their cheeks, not from sadness, but from relief. Deep, full, soul-level relief. They realized they had spent years running from their mind, fearing their thoughts, silencing their emotions, burying their needs. And now, after weeks of listening, they finally understood the simplest truth. Their mind was not an enemy. It had been asking for attention. It had been begging for rest. It had been pleading for compassion. They placed their hand on their heart and whispered, "Thank you for staying with me." And the sentence echoed through the room like a vow. They dimmed the lights, climbed into bed, and tucked the blanket around their body. Outside, the foghorn echoed again, deep and slow, a sound that once made them feel small, but now made them feel held. As they lay there in the dim room, listening to the gentle hum of the night, they realized something that sent warmth through their entire chest. They were not disappearing. They were returning to themselves, returning to the body they had abandoned, returning to the mind they had feared, returning to the life that had been waiting for them to wake up. They whispered one final truth into the darkness, a truth that held everything they had learned. I am finally home, inside myself. And with that, their breath deepened, their body softened, and for the first time in months, they drifted into sleep not with fear, but with peace. The kind of peace that comes when a person stops running and finally decides to stay.